ten jest młoda. Muzyka. O, dobra. Majtniczek. Dało się mocno.
Ja, oder sag doch. Keine Ahnung, was ich
the EFL semi-final. This debate is between Tokyo ITA, FSU Jena A, Skopje and Macau A. My name is Steph, I'm the chair of the panel. I'll be joined by Lucian, Nita, Colin, Ufi, Andrea and Aaron. The motion for this debate is that this House believes that the IMF and the World Bank should pay reparations to countries adversely affected by structural adjustment policies. Without any further ado, I call upon the Prime Minister to speak to the motion that bears their name.
Sorry. Can
Press the gray.
okay, alright. Thank you.
Can I remind everyone in the audience to put your mobile phones or cell phones on quiet or silent?
Thank you, Madam Speaker and ladies and gentlemen. In the past, many developing countries are forced to implement some particular strategic structural adjustment policy in order to get some loan from the World Bank or IMF. That sometimes this kind of structural adjustment is going to the worst consequence because of the lack of knowledge, because of some lack of something anything like that. So in that kind of situation, we believe that the advanced country or IMF, so entity, have hugely responsible for in order to compensate the time wasted in the past, also the harm that provided. Also, Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, it is hugely necessary for those countries in a huge depression in order to change the society, to reconstruct the society. That's kind of it's reparations are necessary. So I'm going to talk about the model of this debate. First of all, what is the structural adjustment policy? That kind of thing is like enforcement from the IMF or such kind of international entity in order to get along. It's a conditional one. So they are forced to do this without any kind of opposite arguments. Like even though there's such kind in the past developing country the government wanted to try to do another policy, they believe that it is good for the country, but they didn't have a right to do this. Because this is enforcement, and they didn't need money or debt or in order to change the society in the first place. And secondly, how much is the kind of like the amount of reparation is not about number. It depends on the situation. It depends on the situation, how worse the war is, and also how much of the money is required to reconstruct the society. This is a point in this. So let me talk about 2 points in my speech, in my substantial. Yes.
In terms of reparation, how is IMF and World Bank going to do it? Is it a one-time, one-time term, or what kind of thing?
Right. So we are very happy, more than happy to create such kind of like committee of constructed by the government, or like United Nations. It's also like there are several executives from many countries in order to satisfy the demands of the developing country, also in order to balance out the argument also coming from the advanced countries. No. Let me talk about why 2 things. Firstly, why principally IMF should pay, or IMF or World Bank should pay the reparations. And secondly, let me talk about why practically reparation is necessary to for developed country to go into the right way to reconstruct society. Let me talk about for my first points. So first of all, it's 2 reasons why. First one is simply that such kind of entity are hugely responsible for the harm created by that kind of enforcement. What kind of harm exists? First one is like infrastructure, manufacturing costs. Like they are like IMF believe that at that time they think that the infrastructure is needed particular regions or particular situation or like city in order to get economy better, but that such kind of sometimes like only the maintenance cost is overriding that, like creating the cost, or like such maintenance cost is overriding that, or it's hugely suppressing the budget of the country. It's also like it makes the country it's so difficult to take another policy. In that kind of situation, they are responsible for harm. And also another harm coming from reconstruction is sometimes the developing country are required to open the markets. Like in order for the advanced country try to export many products to the developing country, the less tariff is required because upon the unconditional, like conditional debt. In that kind of circumstances, sometimes because the developing country is importing a lot of the products from the advanced country, it's really adversely affecting the domestic industry of the developing country, like the car or manufacturing or like agriculture, anything else. Like also the harm provided. So those harm is totally largely depending on the policy of IMF or the World Bank on the power to be the unconditional debt. We believe this is responsibility of IMF. And also secondly, not only the harm, just only the physical harm can be seen. Also they have to compensate for the time consumed by the cost of intervention. Like for example, if the 50 years ago, like the developing country in Africa try to do some particular like implementation, and this is failed. Such kind of 50 years, it can be lost forever. Maybe they might be able to do another policy, might be able to be developed more in the status quo, but they couldn't do this anymore. 50 years is a long time, and more, even though it's 30 years, and no matter the time, that kind of time should be compensated by the country. Now, secondly, I'm going to talk about like why the practical reparation is necessary to go to the right way. First of all, this could be the large money for required to be required. I don't think how much money can be estimated in these points. But first of all, why this money is needed? It's firstly, in order to reconstruct the infrastructure, it's huge amounts of money is necessary. Like in order to change the map of the infrastructure, the money is first of all needed. And secondly, in order to create new industry like agriculture, like manufacturing, is also needed. I said in my first argument of talking about tariff or like exporting, because of the open market system that is forced by the advanced country or like IMF entities, if they lose the own industry, that can be strained to be a great exporter. We believe that in that specific circumstances, also the IMF is responsible to create new industry in order for the developing country to be competing well sufficiently for other country. And for all those reasons, we believe that. Let me clarify our points. First of all, IMF and other entities are highly responsible for those harm should be compensated in the two level. Only also time and also physical harm can be provided. And that's kind of circumstances like IMF or those entities are very responsible because all the enforcement is coming from them. The developing countries have no idea, have no power to be opposed, no responsibility on the developing country in that kind of circumstance. We believe that's why we are very specifically proud to propose. Thank you very much.
Thank the speaker for their speech and call upon the leader of the opposition.
Thank you. I will explain. Sorry. What do I have to use? Okay, thanks. Again, thanks for the floor. We will explain why the government's proposal will lead to bad outcomes for the countries we are talking about, why they will be at least worse off because they wouldn't receive any money at all, because we will have bad incentives for the IMF and the World Bank we are talking about. Generally, we are on the opposition side. We want to show that we think that we will have no benefits the government is talking about, but that we will lots of harm, and this I am going to explain. On the one hand, I will go and talk about responsibility and why we think that responsibility is a very interesting point if you are talking about reparation. We think that we should clear a responsibility if we damn someone to pay this reparation, and that this is not given here. I will talk furthermore about informed consent, and then I will go on talking a lot about the incentives we send on the one hand to those countries and on the other hand to the IMF and to the World Bank. But first a little bit of rebuttal. Firstly, the opening government unfortunately failed to give us one clear example on which country we are talking about. They also didn't make clear what of these adjustments we are talking about. They didn't give us a real example about this adjustment. The only example they give was the market liberation, and we on the opposition side want to state that kinds of maybe market liberalization may be a little bit harmful in the beginning when they are implemented, but we think that it is a status of development. So in the first time, maybe, so if you have market liberation for a country, then it may be that the domestic industry is depressed. But we think that if it is possible to produce some goods for lower money, if you can produce it in another way, then there is no reason why we should pay more for it. And we think that this is one sign of development, and we are proud that this will happen on our side. Yeah, they didn't give us an example, and this was unfortunately the only case they talked about, and so I would like to show firstly why we think the reparation payment is not applicable for those situations. Why is that? So, reparations are paid if you was aware of harming someone. If you caused an harm, you were totally aware of it. And we think that we, on this case, have to talk about the responsibility. So, if you are going to a bank and want to have a credit, then you know what are the conditions of those credits. And also the developing countries know, and it is talked about in the beginning, what the conditions of those receivement of the money they receive are. And we think that if we just blame the IMF, or if we just blame those adjustments, then we lack that there are other reasons in those countries. So often the countries we are talking about, African countries for example, they suffer from structural problems. They suffer from corruption. And we think if these countries are not able to improve with the money we gave them, and it is caused by corruption, and it is caused by structurally things in those countries, then it is not a good incentive to say, yeah, it is totally okay, you can have another loan, you can have another money, we will just cut off all the costs you are responsible for. And we think if we follow this system, these countries wouldn't improve at all, and we won't. It is not a good way to give money to them. So we think it would be wrong. It is wrong to just make the IMF responsible for those countries losing money when it depends on other problem. So. But the even more important thing is which kind of sign we are sending to the IMF and the World Bank. But before closing.
Yes. The IMF and the World Bank were the ones that have actually proposed certain reforms, and those reforms are the ones that have failed into these countries. How can you claim that actually the IMF and World Bank are not responsible when their proposed reforms are the ones that failed to have these countries even more negatively affected?
Yes, I get it. So on the one hand, we doubt that you can claim that this is only responsibility is for those adjustments. We think that in those countries we have these structural problems, and we think if we give them the idea and we give them the opportunity to say, yeah, every time the other party is responsible, every time the responsibility lies actually into the fault of those adjustabilities, and unfortunately we didn't get one good example for that, then we think these countries don't have an incentive to improve at all. And the even better case for our side is that we want to show, and I want to analyze how the IMF and the World Banks are actually working. So the IMF is founded by special states. So the money the IMF has and the money the World Bank has come from other states. So actually, the states have an interest what is done with their money in those countries. And actually, if I am the one who gives money to someone, then it is totally clear that they want to have special conditions, and they also want to have some advantages from this leanings, from that they loan this money to those countries. And we think all these countries we are probably talking about, they would be worse off if they didn't receive any money at all. So we think what would be the alternative to the status quo like we have it, and after we would follow this government's proposal, we think that it is much likely that we wouldn't have money for those countries at all. So when are these countries going to claim for this money? They go to the IMF when they don't have any money at all, when they are insolvent. And we think that this money is in the most cases it is the only way they could go on and they could survive economically the following years. And we think that in all the cases that we would be able to provide those money and those payments in the future. Therefore, it is necessary that we don't blame the IMF, which we want to trust and which we want to be engaged in this affairs and for the future. So, what have we shown on the government side today? On the one hand, we want to acknowledge that there are often in those countries there are structural problems and there are other problems which lead to are responsible that these actions are not going to work like we want them to work, and it's a bad incentive if there is a possibility to always blame the IMF and the World Bank, and on the other hand that we will have bad incentives for the IMF, and therefore we beg you to oppose.
Ladies and gentlemen, let me make it clear what the case of the OJ is. We say there's a time that world banks give money to developing country and tell them to do whatever world banks tell them to do. And then some of the case work and some didn't. And we say the debate here is what should we do to the case that didn't work? Do World Bank and IMF has the responsibility to pay a reparation to them or not, right? And we say that many kind of structural policies could have been done in those countries. For example, be it what kind of infrastructure, or like just open the market, make it a free market, or make it a really intense big government economic stance, right? Many structure could have done, but some choice from World Bank suggests to country was completely wrong. And we say World Bank was too irresponsible up to now, and we say they should bear the responsibility now and pay the reparation. So what we heard from LO, first they say she spent a couple of minutes tell us why IMF and World Bank is working. Well, we say there's not a relevant argument in this debate, because yes, it sometimes works, it sometimes don't, but the debate here is to the case that didn't work, that failed, that should World Bank have the responsibility to pay the reparation back or not. And secondly, she claimed that if we require World Bank to pay reparations, everyone will blame IMF and everyone will blame World Bank for the failure. We say no, even we require IMF and World Bank pay a reparation, we still have people to think about what is the other reasons of the failure, for example corruption. There still be criticism of the other reasons that lead to the failure. We say it's not true that everyone will blame that all the failures due to World Bank. We just say to some extent your structure, that suggestions might be part of the reason to that failure. But secondly, we say that's even a good thing if we become to blame World Bank, because the problem we bring to you is up to now we do not blame World Bank at all. We just think just because the intention of World Bank is good, that's why whatever they suggest to the corporations was good. We say the blame, if we can increase the condemnations and increase the considerations whether or not these suggestions that World Bank give to Africa countries or developing countries was good or not, we say those discussion and those condemnations was actually a benefit in our product. So what I'm going to bring to you in my substantive. Firstly, I'll tell you why IMF and World Bank should have this responsibility to pay back the reparation. And secondly, I'll explain why there's a necessity to require this World Bank and IMF to pay reparations for the development of these developing countries that we want to help. So first, why they should have the responsibility. We say when we consider what kind of responsibility an organization should have, we do not only consider the intentions of the action they take, right? We also consider the consequence they take. So even if the World Bank do something or suggest something in a good intentions, but we still should let them have the responsibility to pay back the reparations as organizations, because they have this bad consequence to others. But secondly, we say in many cases that the IMF and World Bank did not really give the best situation they could have give to these developing countries. What do I mean? For two reasons. Firstly, because in many cases, when they suggest they make the suggestions, the incentive was not purely to help these developing countries, but in many cases, some part of the incentive is to prioritize the interests of the Western advanced country. Because as a structure of World Bank, we know that if the member in the meeting, that more than 70% member deny their suggestion, the World Bank can deny it. And more than 70% of the member are American citizens. And we say in those cases, US had the power to deny all the suggestions. This is against the interests of US, and we already see many examples of that. And we say just because in these cases you're not complete, your extension at the first place is not completely want to help this developing country, you somehow prioritize in some cases for the Western country interest as a trade-off of the risk that this developing country might go the wrong direction. We say this is the first reason that why World Bank should have the responsibility to pay reparations. But secondly, we say just because Western countries is too responsible and too arbitrarily to decide what is the best suggestion for each countries, even if they have the intention to help them, because they assume what have succeeded in Western countries will also succeed in those countries. But that's not the fact, right? for example, to taking a big government stance on economy or taking a free market stance, we say which program will be successful to largely depend on how the citizens of that national is, what's the national character of those citizens are. We say World Bank's too irresponsible and too negligent to those character. And the suggestions to them was not considering those facts. We say because they fail on giving the best suggestion to Africa, this is another reason that they should have paid the reparations. But thirdly, we say when you give this suggestion to them, you waste the time. For example, you tell them to open your market, and when that market when we wait for that free market system to take effect, when we want to evaluate them, it takes time, and this time could have make this country develop better if they have their own structure, right? We say just because you're wasting their time, and this should be another reason that for the IMF to make the reparations. Closing.
If the local government knows better of your local structure or economic structure, you should have rejected the proposal if you think that is not good for your country. Why you have to blame IMF after you accept that there is your failure of corruption in your internal economy?
No. We don't say that government might be, government generally will be a better actor than Western, which is that when there's a fact, when this already happened that World Bank suggested, and when this already happened, should World Bank have the responsibility to pay reparation or not? That is a debate. So, second argument, why we think that's a necessity. We say because many times that the reason why the suggestion fail, the development fail, or the structure fail is because the IMF and World Bank stop or decrease the fund from those developing countries, and those countries fall into a dilemma that they do not have enough money to keep going on that structure suggest, and they do not have enough money to change the structures. For example, in Chad, that in 2008, the World Bank give money to them to develop oil production projects, and then World Bank retreat. And what happened is that oil project equipment become a completely polluted land for the Chad. And if we let the require World Bank to give back some reparations to Chad, we say this oil projects on that land could have been really productive for the Chad economic development. If you don't, then it would just become a polluted land that is totally caused by the World Bank. So we say also as a necessity, the World Bank should pay money for this developing country we propose.
Thank the Deputy Prime Minister for their speech and the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
As Tina already pointed out, we as the opening opposition believe that actually opening government failed to set up a decent model for this debate. Why do we think so? We didn't get any analysis on how it actually would change afterwards. We didn't hear why, like we never got through with our POIs, so we didn't understand how is it going to change our, like the ENF giving up loans in the future. Will there still be those market, is it still our condition for future contracts with other states to do those structural adjustments or not? We think it's very unfairly from them to just saying, well, we're going to do some some structural adjustment policies and others not. But we never got any explanation which one we're going to do in the future and which one we wouldn't do in the future. So actually, yeah, in order to set up this debate, we should just agree that probably if we see now, like if OG just tells us it's not good what we did in the past, we have to, in order to debate and in order to have a clash, we should assume that they don't want to do the same as they did in the past, right? So therefore, we're going to stand for still claiming, like it is in the status quo, it should still be, those conditions should still be in place. For example, like our first claim being economic market liberations are necessary in order for a country to actually pass the time of development and to actually go into like being a Western like being like a Western liberal democracy, being like a state that is functional, being a state that is economically prosperous, and everything that Tina already pointed out. Our proof for that would be if a country actually lacks all that, like if a country doesn't have the economic market liberalization that necessary, we see that there's actually less development, we see that there are usually less human rights, and we see that there are always less good living conditions. So we actually see that all those countries that are successful in the world today actually have those liberalizations passed. So we believe this is actually proof why we think it's necessary to do so. So first, we believe, of course, you can have that trade-off. It will be harder for these countries when they actually get our our structural adjustment policies, right? So if they have to do it, it will be firstly harder. But we believe in the end, in the long run, it does more good than harm if we force them to do it. They won't do it on their own, so this is why the EWF and the world as a whole should have forced those countries to actually take the steps necessary to fulfill and be in this economic power like we want them to be. So first I would like to talk about privatization. Why do we believe that privatization is the best that can happen to those countries? We believe those countries that depend on the loans by the World Banks actually have two things in common. Firstly, they are usually very corrupt, as Tina already pointed out. And secondly, they are usually not democratic. Why are these things very problematic? Like Tina told you, it's usually like the leaders will profit the most from this proposal. The leaders will see now that they don't have any incentive to actually transform the loans, like the money that they gain, into good things for their people, right? Because they will always have the idea that if I'm gonna mess up, I will get a second chance. I will get one more time the money, like getting the money twice. We think it's a very bad incentive and actually a backslash on the idea and what you actually want to do over there. And the other thing about the corruption, why is it so bad? We believe, if a country is not, if companies are not privatized, what does it mean about a corrupt system? For example, like those people actually pride each other. So for example, it means that usually in those countries they are so corrupt, they don't usually get the best people employed for the state, right? So why is that problematic? We believe, first of all, instead of hiring somebody who could actually, who's getting paid and who could actually work for the benefit of the whole society, for the benefit of the nation, it would be somebody not as well equipped mentally and from his whole situation to actually work. And this person that the government chooses then because he was prided or because of his ancestry, because of the family he comes from, they will be less effective. So all the firms we see today in those countries are actually less incentives. For example, it's very often with transportation system. So what we can actually force the people to do in the past and we want to do in the future now, and ENF is forcing them to privatize those transport companies. What will it lead to? We will actually, we need it to be more effective in order to destroy this system that we see right now. We say, for example, in the transportation system, it's like a synergy effect by creating better transform systems. For example, if we shut down airports that are not effective, like we, for example, did in Greece right now, we believe, of course, it's bad for the people who actually work in the airport. But in the end, it's more effective for the whole society if there are not 5 airports and 4 of them are running low and don't make any profit at all. Because then there is costs and spending for the government. They actually have to pay for 4 or 5 airports if they only need 1. And we think this is really bad and they shouldn't do it. Okay, so we believe we will have a more effective economy in the end. Why is it also good, for example, like the free trading unions? We believe we should force the people to actually have those free trading unions. Okay, that's the whole idea of capitalism, right? We say that each country had actually to specialize on something, like Tina pointed out. We should say that if they're not very effective and cannot count on a free trading market, like if Morocco cannot produce as cheap as Spain can, then we shouldn't buy our tomatoes in Morocco. No, we should build them actually in Italy, we think, or in Spain, where it is cheaper. We think that's the whole idea about worldwide globalization. So, of course, in short time you can have that. We might have bad for some people if they are unemployed now, but we believe in order to have a better system for everybody, a more effective system, we should of course force the people to do so. Your question?
Yeah, free trade might work sometimes, but if World Bank forces countries to have this free trade and it fails, do you think it means World Bank partially responsible for that?
Thanks. I see. Okay, I see what you mean. Well, we say it might be so, but then it's still right what Tina said, informed consent, they know the conditions. It's the same if I personally go to my bank and I actually know if I will mess up, I don't get another chance. So, but the other thing is, we say the risk will be a lot higher in the future. Like usually, as of right now, each individual country, they actually pay for the ENF in order to give those loans, right? Those countries won't do it anymore. So we see a direct harm of your proposal. The harm is that the interest rate will be a lot higher for all the other countries who actually apply for the loans. Why is that? We say in order to rescue the risk for the future companies, for the future countries that are applying, it will be a lot higher because the risk is more dangerous, so they cannot control the risk because it depends on those countries, so they don't have influence. So we believe it will be a lot harder to get, first of all, countries to donate to the ENF, and we believe it will be a lot harder for poor countries to actually apply for the loans and get them. And even if they get it, the interest rate on those loans will be a lot higher. And this is a direct harm because then we can help less countries under your proposal, and I'm very glad to oppose.
Speaker for their speech and call upon the government members.
Dear panel, we live in a world where we prefer and value the well-being of international funds, the well-being of private entities, rather than the well-being of human beings who live in countries, right? We, as an opposition, principally believe that regardless of the model, and we don't want to debate about the tidbits of the model, we're going to principally show you why there's a huge problem coming out of the 1970 reforms that were enacted in African countries, and we're going to show you how we're going to solve the problem, firstly, and secondly, how principally these countries and these people are owned our own reparations. Like, we hear like basically three arguments from side government. First of all, we hear a lot of talk about corruption and how these countries are not using the money well and will not have an incentive to use the money in the future, since they will know that they're gonna get some more after they've just used it up. So, three problems here. First of all, this is a huge assumption. Secondly, the problem here is that these people were forced to use the money in a specific way. So let's say most of the time they talk about how liberation is a great thing. Well, we say that there is a problem here. First of all, they have to prove us as a burden why liberation is the best outcome and policy in every single country. Secondly, not every country is prepared, like the people are not prepared to accept these reforms. Secondly, the administration is not prepared to accept these reforms. So these money were forced to be used in a way that this country was not ready to use this sort of money, and this is why this money failed to help the people. Secondly, they talk about how basically these countries were negligent, and because they were given the money, they didn't use it in a proper way, and they should get used to using the money as much as they can. So we see a problem here. The problem being that basically when you are a country and you know the problem, the social problems, the economical problems in the country, you make the decisions about how to invest those money that you get to invest, right? And we see this as a problem when the IMF is forcing certain structural reforms, especially since they never learned their lesson and they're trying to do it again in Greece, right? So we see a lot of examples in Greece that they're trying to force policies into the Greek state, in economical policies, where they know when the Greek government and the people surely don't want to accept them because they know they're not ready to accept them. The second thing they talk about is how basically people knew what they were getting into. Three problems there. First of all, even if they knew what they were getting into, right? So these people didn't have any sort of choice to decide not to take the funds, right? The country was in recession. These countries were not able to not accept the funds, so they were basically coerced and forced. Secondly, even though if governments knew and the presumption that they were corrupt, people didn't know, right? So then again, people are the ones who are facing the neglect of their governments, and the people are the ones who are facing the consequences of the decisions and on the burden. And lastly, they talk about how huge countries will not have the incentive to give out more money to the IMF. So first of all, that's now how basically things work. Like big countries don't just pour money in the IMF, right? That's the first thing. And secondly, we're going to talk about in the extension how basically we see this as a benefit where countries are distinguishing themselves, the big countries are distinguishing themselves from the IMF and the World Bank. So let's go to my incentive. So firstly, we're going to talk about how the money is being given away, right? So I've explained a bit how basically the IMF and the World Bank are forcing these reforms on countries who have no other choice but to accept them. But secondly, we see that in a lot of the cases, big countries are influencing the World Bank and IMF to take and push certain reforms onto smaller countries who are expecting loans. Again, we see that the Troika was largely forced by the European Union and Greece to push to IMF, to push certain reforms in Greece. And this has been happening also in the 1970s. The problem that we see here is basically big countries who colonized these smaller countries, these smaller African countries in the past, are not now again pushing reforms, again pushing something that is going to be in their benefit in the future. So what we see happened in the 1970s, right, in most African countries, they were push reforms that they were unable to implement. They were not ready for the liberalization of the market, and most importantly, we see that these countries had a certain benefit of the liberalization. After the reforms were pushed, the markets were liberalized, and a lot of transnational companies got to enter that specific country, right? So we see after the reforms were enforced, Nike, Coca-Cola, and huge multinational, multi-trans companies entered those countries. So we see the benefits coming for bigger countries from the liberalization of these smaller countries. And again, we see the gap being increased between the bigger and the smaller countries, and we find this first principle simply unfair when we prefer human lives more for countries who live in richer countries, and secondly, we prefer companies rather than human lives. Before I go on. Can you explain how under your model we will maintain the motivation of the IMF to give credit to those countries, and what are the alternatives? Thank you, madam. I'm getting to it. It is my last point. So what we're going to talk about is how basically right now the IMF will have the incentive to distance themselves from the decisions of the bigger countries. Why is that so? We see again in Greece, the IMF and the World Bank were very aware that Greece cannot return the funds, right? But they just keep pushing the reforms, and they just keep pushing money into Greece. Right now, we believe that under this model, regardless of the specification of the model, under the model and under the motion, we believe that the IMF will make more smart decisions, right? If we enforce a policy which states that if you harm a country by enforcing specific reforms, not by giving them money, but by giving them money and specifying how they should use the money, in the future the IMF will be more aware of the necessity of that country and the specific economical stability, structure, or simply the people willingness to accept the reform in the future. And that is why we believe that the IMF in the future will make more smart, and the World Bank will make more smart decisions. So lastly, what did we bring to you to this debate? First of all, we say that we value human lives more and rather than private companies and huge international entities. Secondly, we believe that the IMF and the World Bank has a moral responsibility because they were pushing a country who was unable to not accept this issue. Lastly, because they knew that they were not going to get the outcome that they wanted to get, and at the end, because they're still doing it to countries who are unable to not accept the conditions. So because we believe that we should be living in a world where the IMF and the big countries should also think about the necessity of the smaller countries, and because we believe that this is the only logical economical solutions for these developing countries, I beg you to oppose the motion. Proposed. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, when Upper House focused on the idea how in the short run is a blame for IMF, we want to emphasize on the long-term on the long-term effect on how it will harm IMF, not only the developing nations as a whole. Before that, several responses to previous speakers. She told you about Greece as a Greek citizens. We think that when Greece also have the courage to reject IMF proposal of austerity measure, that means that local community and local government have the calculus to measure whether this proposal from World Bank or IMF is workable in your country. If that fail, it is not the proposal who inherently fail, but the calculus of your own local government who fail to measure or foresee the future effects, right? In that case, they want to make IMF or World Bank as a charity who have no conditions at all, finally. But we told you no. IMF or World Bank as an international body who want to microfinance those developing countries, they should have a more long-term calculus or long-term goal. That's why they have those strategy packs or guidelines for the developing nations who don't have such rich experience on how to microfinance your nations or how to develop your nations as a more advanced economy. And that is how the goal of IMF or World Bank is fulfilled. But several points to address to previous speakers. So her main point is about the timing, right? The countries, the developing nations are not ready to use the money while IMF forced them to. Three levels of analysis. First, we think that mostly when the policy thing from the IMF proposal is about you should develop new industry in your country, meaning that most of the money in the loan package is used to develop a new industry. When that new industry fail, we don't think that any externality to other industry that is already existing in your country is exaggerated or what. In this case, conclusion is the externality from other consequence is limited. But second level, we think that most often IMF also require you to deflate your currency. We think that that's the common strategy used in the developing nations on how to revive your economy, and that is the common strategy also currently used in China and Japan on how to deflate your currency so that you increase your competitiveness in the international market on a lower price exports, right? We think that's totally legit for you to have a such guideline or strategy. But let's have a worst case comparison, right? With IMF guideline, you fail, you still have IMF accountability to have you to provide you more loans package in the future. But what happened is you don't accept IMF guidelines, you fail, you're officially dead, and you cannot ask more help from the other institutions, which will be further elaborated in my extension. But last level, we think that when IMF require most often more transparency in your government, it is not because of the transparency policy who failed, but the administration procedure in the local government who failed to achieve transparency so that you fail your future economy as a whole. We think that this structural failure still fail. It is not account to the failure of the IMF proposal. We think that they're simply shifting the blame to IMF, right? To extension. In my speech, I'm going to prove to you how what is the calculus of developing countries and IMF, and the impact is, first, member states withdrawing their contributions to IMF or World Bank. Second, lessening the developing countries' willingness to ask for loans. Going first, I think that the calculus of developing nations, why you have to ask for IMF loans instead of your local banks or international banks? The reason is, first, you have a low credibility or weighting so that the banks don't want to lend to you, or second, they see it very less likely for you to repay, right? And thirdly, it's because the sum of loans is too large for them to afford. That's why those developing nations, they turn to IMF to compensate for all those mistakes that they cannot lend from the local banks. We think that for having a larger capital and a lower interest rate, that actually IMF is a last resort for developing nations. Meaning that at the time they opt to IMF or World Bank, they develop a trust or last resort calculus on IMF that they have to accept this, they have to bear the consequence of the proposal, right? But on the IMF, right, we think that
they are actually deterring any kind of conditions proposed by IMF. How? We think that a good intention from IMF or World Bank is, firstly, they want to revive, they want to recover your economy so that you have a capability to repay in the future. Nobody wants to lend to a country who is not able to repay in the future. Meaning that for all those considerations that they are in the proposal, they actually take into as much consideration they can to put their shoes into those developing nations to ensure they can repay in the future. You don't want to give money like a charity at the end of the day. But what happened in their paradigm, no thank you, is that first, you withdraw the member states' contribution. Because think about it, when US or EU want to give money to IMF, first they want positive contributions. Second, they want reputation. Even the firstly, positive contribution, you don't really have so much schools built in your state, at least you have a reputation that United States contribute a lot to help those African countries. But what happened in their paradigm is, now USA is having a bad cause to ruin the industry in African countries when the cause of the failure of the economy is not from the United States. Before that, yes.
Madam, you do realize that in a lot of cases, the IMF and the World Bank is aware that countries wouldn't be able to repay them the money. However, countries do gain some sort of political power in those countries who those countries gave the money for the loans.
We don't see, like, even you say political leverage is important and you don't want to ruin that countries, simply reject the proposal like Greece did, right? We don't see how that is actually an impact. Continue. Member state, we think that when the countries opt to IMF and want more capitals, because those capitals are from the international market, there's actually a huge sum than any other local banks can afford. We think that when US or EU, who have the largest economic capability, who back out from IMF, that they no longer want to borrow or contribute money into IMF, the impact is, first, you're lessening the pool of money in the IMF, and second, you're also less likely to solve the economic problem in the developing nations. What happened more is that in the developing nations, reparation means you're wrong. You are the cause of all the failures. Developing nations will be less prone to borrow from IMF. What happened at the end is that we will create a shrinking IMF or World Bank that first, no member state in the IMF want to contribute because they are receiving very bad reputation even they are lending money, and secondly, nobody want to borrow money from IMF. We think that this international body who help much in the international market to revive our country's economy is officially dead if in their paradigm at the end of the day. So we told you the trust and good intent from IMF very, very proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker for their speech and call upon the government whip.
May I begin? Madam Speaker, I'm going to summarize this debate in two main points. Firstly, I'm going to talk to you about how actually by forcing reforms and by having these policies that the IMF have actually imposed to these countries have helped, how actually we believe that they are responsible for it. But moreover, I'm going to show you how by enforcing this kind of model, we are going to improve IMF and the World Bank, and that will actually give bigger incentive to the countries to give money to the IMF. Before that, few points of rebuttal from what we heard from the side of the closing opposition. Firstly, we heard how actually what they were talking about is that countries do have the power to reject these policies. Firstly, this is not true, because most of these countries which found themselves in Africa, who were developing countries, most of them were facing crisis. These loans that were given by the IMF were mostly given at times such as 90s and 80s, when these were actually young countries who have almost recovered from colonization, which means that we have certain problems within these countries that had to be addressed. And these countries were in dire need of money, which means that when you're in dire need of money, most of the times they actually have no other choice but to accept this. But they actually give us the example of Greece, and that they said Greece has that Greece actually have rejected these policies. Firstly, not true. Greece at the end of the day accepted the agreement, and Greece at the end of the day implemented the agreement, although the people within Greece actually didn't agree with it, which means we can just see how firstly IMF and World Bank, but moreover how they actually, what my partner has brought to you the analysis, that they actually cooperate with these big countries in order to impose these reforms who are actually harming the countries that are where actually these reforms have to be imposed, which only shows how these countries and the IMF and the World Bank are dominant over these countries, and this is a scenario that we actually want to do not want to have. Secondly, they were talking about how actually that this money are mostly given for developing industries. Firstly, most of the times not true, because this money are mostly given, for example, for market liberalization, for making structural reforms, for example, within the political elites or the corruption within it, which means that most of the times these are not money that say develop certain industries. But even if that was the case, even if we actually consider to the fact that they give to the industries, IMF and the World Bank mostly, they always give specific conditions and specific way of how you should implement a certain policy, which means that if these countries implement these policies and they fail, this is a responsibility of the IMF. What we heard also from the first opposition is that, oh look, they will not have the incentive to implement the policies because they will benefit from the reparations afterwards. Firstly, we do not live in a society where we just give someone money and do not take a report for what happens with that money. If you take a look at all of the, for example, all of the money that have been given to countries such as Spain, Portugal, Greece, and etc., who have been affected by the economic crisis right now, we see that they have to give full report and they're being constantly monitored about what happens with that money, which means that countries and IMF do not just give out money and say, yeah, free for all, do whatever you want. What they do is receive reports and they're monitoring the situation within these countries, and that's what they actually do in developing countries, which means that this only shows how actually when they implement the reforms, because they have to do so, they actually, when they fail, we believe that makes the IMF even more responsible. Moreover, they also said that no one wants to give money to countries who will not pay back. Also, by examples proven not to be true. They have given money to the countries in the 70s and 80s that haven't paid them back. They gave money to Argentina during the economic crisis 2002, and they still keep giving money to Greece, although each and every economist who actually is at his senses knows that these reforms will not succeed and Greece probably will not be able to pay the money back, which means that, but what they actually gain, and this is something that my partner has explained to you very well, has actually come up and said into the POI, is that they gain political influence into these countries and they tend to dominate these countries even more and dictate what is going to happen with these countries or not. Before I continue, please.
With or without conditions, you still have that political power in your loan package. Why your policy is mutually exclusive to ours?
Can you please repeat the question?
With or without conditions on IMF package, you still have those political power. So that's why the inherent choice is still made by the government instead of those conditions made by IMF proposals.
Thank you, madam. But when you don't really have much of a choice, whether, for example, your country will fall apart and go bankrupt, or whether you can receive some sort of help and implement these conditions, we don't believe that the government themselves do have much of a choice, and we don't believe that they can actually prioritize or because if there was other choice which would be better than implementing so much reforms that would at the end of the day maybe fail, we don't believe that actually that goes to your side of the house. Now, what have we actually given to you in this debate? Well, firstly, Teodora has brought to you into her analysis that actually these countries, because they didn't have much of a choice, and also they do accept these policies that in the end of the day in many countries have failed. Now we're not contesting that reforms are necessary, but what Teodora has shown to you and what the opposition has tried to claim, to you that actually market liberalization is the best thing that happened to any country. Teodora into her analysis has shown you that actually this is not the best outcome into every country, and we believe that the IMF and the World Bank several times into history have failed by trying to push certain reforms into these countries, because not every country is actually capable of implementing all those reforms that we have into the big countries at the very same time, and we do not think that actually they do have the conditions that they will fulfill with these reforms. Now, also, what actually Teodora has shown to you is that these countries and these institutions, such as the IMF and the World Bank, are mostly dominant by the big countries, so they also want to gain even bigger political influence when they actually give out these reforms. But moreover, now let's talk about what happens on our side side of the house because this was not even contested from the side of the opposition. We actually gain even better and improved IMF because firstly, they will be able, when you do have this kind of policy, when they have to pay reparations, that would mean that the IMF will have to lose money. And even though they have sometimes lost money, IMF does not actually want to lose even more money, which means that you're going to have improved IMF, which will test on case-by-case basis whether certain reforms are good in certain countries or whether these reforms are not good in these countries. So even if you get a scenario in which, for example, some reforms fail into these countries, they're going to try to improve or change the reforms that they're imposing on certain countries. Moreover, why we believe that the countries will still have incentive to actually give money to the IMF is because they actually firstly also have the incentive to give money to other countries firstly because of certain political influence that they're still going to have over there, but moreover because if you actually get an improved IMF which says that if they test on case-by-case basis, it is more likely that countries will succeed to make better reforms, that also means that probably they will get their money back within a certain future. So because we have shown you that firstly, even IMF will be more successful over there, but moreover that we're actually going to have more successful reforms and less bad outcomes for the countries, we are very proud to propose this motion. Thank you.
Thank the speaker for their speech and call upon the opposition whip to conclude this debate.
Madam Speaker, what kind of country or what kind of policy and scenario that government want? They simply they actually tell you nothing, but let us illustrate it. They actually want two scenarios. Firstly, either IMF and World Bank or any kind of body will not give any kind of condition and just let the country to decide in which they believe that and assume that those countries know their country best and assume that those countries at its best scenario would recover the economy. Second scenario they believe is if in case you really want condition, you have to bear full responsibility because I listen to you. However, when you actually think about the purpose of IMF and World Bank in itself, it actually has no compulsory responsibility to make sure to make sure that you progress in the future, and more importantly, they in itself has no responsibility to help you in the very first beginning. They assume that IMF and World Bank necessarily and absolutely have to help you in the very first beginning. So in this situation, we believe that the case is false. But more importantly, when you listen to closing government's analysis about the power to decision, right? In this situation, what scenario we have to compare? In the current status quo, you have to compulsorily follow the instruction, right? However, in that situation, even if they only talk about IMF have to listen and consider the condition of the country, and it have ultimately actually move forward to a no condition scenario. Why? It is because when IMF allow countries to decide by themselves, countries necessarily will protect their own interests, essentially extremely have the interest of their own political party in power. So in this situation, those conditions in this is not working. So how are you going to prove that after IMF actually accept those conditions, you're gonna improve? The analysis come from CG only tell you, Greek people don't want to accept it, and Greek people think that they know the best of their country. However, this is out of the concern of the Greek citizen individually, not the country in itself. If the Greek really know what is good for the country, regretfully, we don't think the current situation happened right now, right? But more importantly, let us compare the situation in two different clashes. Firstly, think about the cultural relation between IMF and the developing country, and second of all, what will happen in the future, right? Firstly, about cultural relation, we actually we hear a lot of analysis of reasons why they should have responsible. Coming from OG, firstly, and also from CG, because it's not a perfect decision. Secondly, time is wasted. Thirdly, West manipulated. However, let us compare whether or not with condition or without condition in the past, whether or not these three these factors will not exist, right? Firstly, perfect decision. We have to think whether or not perfect decision is more likely to make by IMF or by the country in itself, right? If assume that IMF in the past do not have any kind of condition, whether or not the countries or developed countries will not fail. This is actually not about the consequence and intention to its fault, but more about the risk management, right? Proposed by Cindy in her speech. In terms of risk management, the reason why we think that even if developing countries fail, still the current situation is a less harmful one because they have more capable in managing the risk failure in the past. So in this situation, even if IMF you can prove that they are not having a perfect decision, either in your side is not proven to have a perfect decision, and then in this situation they would argue about if failure will occur after no condition, the country in themselves will be held responsible. For example, let's assume that in those African countries, no condition, money will be given and economy fail. In this situation, you put IMF in an even worse scenario by not saying that IMF has done a not relatively good job in providing guidelines, but actually IMF has responsibility towards its member country as well, by only in the policy of only giving you money. So in this situation, we think that IMF in your side is having a worse situation. But second of all, in terms of the factor of time wasted, even if there is condition or not, time will be wasted anyway if you are failing. So that's actually all about the risk management. And thirdly, about West manipulation, actually provided by CG, right? They told you it is very harmful because West will manipulate it anyway. However, as what Cindy have told you in her POI, in her extent, even with condition, with or without West manipulation happens anyway. But even if in the second layer of analysis, we think that why is it so bad to have a West manipulation to begin with, right? Because right now we're talking about economic restriction and economic restriction policy. So in this situation, the reason why economy fell is because of the political party and political corruption, there's failure happening inside those developing countries in itself. So in this situation, if in case, even if manipulation happened in a worst scenario, at least countries in terms of economy will be improved. Yes.
So basically what you need to accept is that the terms under which these structural reforms take place are dictated by IMF and the World Bank, not by the political elites or political powers within the country who actually accept these terms and conditions.
In terms of the political ideas, they are still actually deterring from the term of risk management itself, right? In terms of financial determining and guideline, majority of the guideline has been actually based on the risk management and policy in itself. So we think that even if political influence exists, still the large majority of it is not sufficient enough for you to argue that IMF should have reparation. Even if OG want to argue at least they have some kind of partial responsibility, then the question will become whether or not reparation should be done, right? They only prove you they actually need assistance because time wasted, because they have a very bad situation. However, they didn't really provide the language of reparation. We told you reparation in itself is not only about assistance only. It's actually about the whether or not you are actually found guilty, and actually you have to make sure that everything will be better off. However, in Cindy's speech, in comparison, even if you think that they should be partially responsible for that action, Cindy provided analysis and alternative of how IMF would continue to help them in the future. But what is the difference between GAF and OP, right? Because in this situation in the future, if you use the term of reparation, essentially means that IMF will lose all its reputation. It is actually a deadlock of opening half by saying blaming or not. However, it is actually not really important whether or not someone will blame IMF, but more importantly, the sustainability of the future funding operation. If in this situation, what will happen in the future? In the future, the date CG want to talk about, you improve. However, at the same time, even if you improve your guideline or something like that, IMF will be more prudent in lending money out. Why is that so important? It is important because right now it's so prudent for IMF already. You're pushing IMF harder to its far extreme of how it can borrow money to other stakeholders. So in this situation, we think the stakeholder of the global economy, particularly the developing country, will be harmed in our side. So for all these reasons, we are very proud to oppose.
Thanks everyone for a wonderful semi-final. I'd like the team to cross the floor, shake hands, and then if everybody could leave this room for the adjudication.
Thank you so much.